Hello everybody, we are here today with Tod Emel. He is part of our current exhibit at Pine Logs Cultural Center titled Sanctuary. He's here today to tell us a little bit about his art and his process and himself. Hi Tod, thank you so much for coming out.
Hello, thanks for having me here.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure, my name, as was mentioned, was Tod. I grew up in Vanderhoof, BC, a small town in the northern part of the province. It's actually right in the middle of BC, but it's not a lot of population north of there, so it's considered northern BC. And I've lived around the country a few times, and I'm here back in BC, in Invermere, BC, and enjoy it a lot. I went to Langara College in Vancouver for the first 2 years of my education, and then I went to Saskatoon to attend the University of Saskatchewan there and finished my Bachelor of Fine Arts at the university there.
Oh.
So that's a little bit about me.
Great. So you brought some of your pieces to show us right now.
Yes.
Can you start off by just kind of explaining how you began your pieces? You build your frames from scratch, is that true? For
sure, yeah. So I was interested for a long time in kind of telling the story of the mountain pine beetle that had taken out a lot of the trees around where I grew up in Vanderhoof. It came through sort of in the late 90s and early 2000s. It really took off. So the hillsides would go from being green, and then as the beetle got in there, it would kill them off and they would turn red, as you're probably familiar with a dead evergreen tree, and then they would go gray. So that color transition, you knew something was wrong. And I was always looking for a way to kind of tell that story. Not a lot of people were familiar with it unless you were from the area or you'd seen it. So I wanted to tell something about that. And so I went through a few processes. I started making a sound art project based on the mountain pine beetle. And from there, I started thinking about doing like printmaking processes to take prints directly off the logs. And then I started looking at sculptural options, and I've done some sculpture with them, but in a lot of the work that I have at the Pine Log Center right now, it's based off of panels that I make out of MDF. I'm a Finnish carpenter by trade, so I do a lot of work with MDF. It's a good material to work with, except it makes a lot of dust, so it can be a little unforgiving and unhealthy that way. But in order to kind of mimic, I guess you could say, the marks that the beetles leave on the surface of the tree in that layer right below the bark, I used a trim router. Originally I started using a Dremel tool with a little bit on there, but I found that the bits burned out really quickly, so I use a trim router at work quite a lot, and I used a core box bit, it's called. It's a little rounded tip bit to make patterns that sort of look similar to the meandering patterns that the beetles will leave on the trees. So this is an example of one of those panels that I've been doing with that kind of carved out pattern on the surface. And as you can see, it's there's regularity to it. It kind of, as we all do, we kind of repeat the same marks over and over again. Our doodles have a bit of a signature to them. So those kind of patterns reemerge, and I sort of set myself up to play with a couple rules with each painting. So for this one, I would start out with, I make a couple turns, and I don't want to turn into the mark too many times, but I want to keep it kind of consistently flowing across the surface. And then after it's all routed and those patterns are made, then I'll go back in and start applying the paint. And there's kind of that all over pattern that looks a little closer to the beetle marks. And then I started regulating it and using some different rules and ended up with something like this. So this is using the same process, but I'll start with a fairly straight line going across the top. I think this one might have actually been the bottom where I started, but I'll make one line all the way across, working left to right. And then I'll emphasize differences as that line goes along. So the first lines, I try to keep it as straight as possible. Then I'll exaggerate those lines for a little bit and those differences. And that's what creates that illusion of almost like topography
Yeah.
or vines or something biological. And then as it goes along here, then I start going back to the really straight lines. So it's just making those decisions about how to change the rules through different iterations as I go along. It's a very sort of process based, I guess, studio practice that I've developed. I did a lot of work in printmaking in university, and so for me it's about thinking about ways to make marks using a process where I don't have to think too much about what I'm doing while I'm doing it. Then I'm able to just kind of exist in the process itself, and then think about it after, and analyze it, and then start applying colors. So that's a little bit about the process.
Very cool. It's definitely very unique, and I find sometimes when you look at it at a certain angle, it almost takes on. It looks like there's almost a 3D dimension to it. Yeah.
And that's that illusion of topography.
Yeah.
So when I was living in Saskatoon, I really missed. I love the prairies. There's a lot of beautiful things about the prairies, but I really do miss the mountains when I'm away from them. Where I grew up was sort of in between. It was a plateau, so you could see mountains in the background, but it was a lot of plains and fields. But I was thinking in my head a lot about wanting to come out to BC and climb in the mountains and just play out here. And where I was at in the prairies obviously is very flat. And within the history of painting, there's a real focus on the plane of the picture plane. And there's a lot of, I guess you could say, aesthetic philosophizing about the importance of that flat plane. So I was thinking about the illusion of depth, right, and that topography illusions that you get in these paintings, and how we might be somewhere but we're picturing somewhere else. So there's what we perceive, and then there's what we're actually seeing, and they're not always the same thing. And so I like to play with the illusion of depth and how we perceive depth. So something like this, as you move around it, or as you turn the piece, you get those, it seems like waves moving. Especially at a really sharp angle, it takes on a whole different sense of depth to it. I've also been, I think, pretty influenced by topographical maps which depict rise and fall of land using illusions, right? It's that spacing of the lines, so you can see how sharp something rises like a mountain on a hillside. So
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming out and telling us a little bit about your work and how you make these amazing pieces.
Thanks, appreciate it.
You can see Tod's art in person at Pine Logs Cultural Center until August 21st. Thanks again, Tod.